Greetings, my name is Tyler Schaefer, and my presentation is on slavery resistance in America during the 1800s specifically. The Haitian slave revolt of 1791 caused much concern for American slave owners all over the place. This caused fear because they were afraid of an uprising of similar rebellions. Their fears of rebellions eventually became true. In the early 1800s up until the Civil War, slave uprisings would frequently occur and they were intensified in the South. There were many forms of resistance from slaves, but one of the most frequent and common style of hostility to slavery was day-to-day resistance, also known as silent sabotage. This was the most common way of resistance because it consisted only of easy ways to fight back. Silent sabotage included doing poor work, breaking tools, abusing animals, and many other ways to disturb and cause chaos within the plantation's procedures. Frederick Law Olmsted, a Northerner who toured the South during the 1850s, noticed that gates would be left open and rails removed from the fences. Many slaves would also pretend to be sick so they could avoid doing work. There was also theft of food. This resistance was so common that a Southern physician diagnosed it as a hereditary disease that was unique to African Americans. Although it was less frequent, serious resistance committed by slaves were arson, poisoning, and armed assaults against individual whites. Slaves that ran away from their masters posed a huge threat to the stability of the slave system. During the War of Independence and the War of 1812, thousands of slaves ran away at an attempt to gain freedom. The problem with runaway slaves was that they had little to no knowledge of geography. It was very difficult for slaves to know where they were going. The only understanding the slaves had of geography was following the North Star, and this was because the North Star was a symbol that led to freedom. Fugitive slaves would also have to worry about being constantly hunted aside from being geographically challenged. Most of the slaves that escaped would live in the upper southern states that bordered on free states. Typically, the runaway slaves would be men because women would not be willing to leave children behind, and children would be too much of a difficult burden to bring along on the strenuous escape journey that was next to impossible. Fugitives in the lower South would typically go for cities like New Orleans and Charleston to help blend in among the expanding communities of free blacks. Many others escaped to isolated areas like the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia, where Seminole Indians offered refuge before they were forced to move west. It was found in Tennessee that a study showed that 40% of fugitive slaves stayed nearby in local areas and 30% went to other areas in the South, while only about 25% attempted to go north. Runaway slaves would eventually lead to the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was an act that required slaves to be returned to their owners despite them being in a free state. The act required the federal government to be responsible in finding, returning, and trying all escaped slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act was initially passed in 1793, but due to much widespread resistance, there was a passage in 1850 which added additional solutions regarding runaways, and imposed more severe punishment for those getting in the way of the slaves' capturers. The Underground Railroad was a system that existed in the northern states before the Civil War, which helped slaves escape from the South, and they were secretly helped by the sympathetic Northerners that defied the Fugitive Slave Acts. They wanted to help them reach places of safety such as the North, or even in Canada. The Underground Railroad got its name not from being underground or being a railroad, but rather from its activities of being carried out in secret. It used darkness in disguise, and it got its name from being similar to a railroad system. It had many different routes that would stop at places called stations. People that would provide aid were known as conductors, and their charges would be called packages or freight. The network spread throughout all directions of the northern states and the promised land of Canada. Canada was known as the Promised Land because it was beyond the reach and jurisdiction of fugitive slave hunters. Those who actively assisted the slaves to escape through the railroad were mainly members of the free black community, although there were many white abolitionists that were involved as well. The estimated numbers of fugitives reaching freedom vary greatly. There is an estimate of approximately 30,000 slaves, while many believe that 100,000 slaves escaped and gained freedom. The existence of the Underground Railroad did a lot to inspire Northern sympathy for the slaves, and at the same time convincing many Southerners that the North would never peacefully allow the institution of slavery to be remained unchallenged. There were few instances of large-scale groups of slaves that would collectively fight for and forcibly gain their freedom, but the most celebrated instance included 53 slaves who in 1839 took control of the Amistad, which is a ship that would transport the slaves from one port located in Cuba to another. The enslaved group of Africans who were captured and sold illegally revolted at sea and won control of the Amistad from the captors. They took control and took an attempt at forcing the navigator of the ship to steer all the way to Africa, but ended up floating along the Atlantic coast. From there, U.S. authorities captured and seized and imprisoned the slaves, which began a legal and diplomatic drama that would shake the foundation of the nation's government and brought the explosive issue of slavery to the forefront of American politics. The story of the Amistad began in February 1839 when Portuguese slave hunters captured hundreds of Americans from Medellin, now known as Sierra Leone in present day, and transported them to Cuba, and then to a Spanish colony. The Spanish plantation owners Pedro Montes and Jose Ruiz purchased the 53 African captives as slaves. Among the slaves included 49 adult males and 4 children, 3 of them being girls. On June 28th, Montes and Ruiz and the 53 Africans set sail from Havana on the Amistad for Puerto Principe. This is where the 2 Spaniards owned plantations. Several days into the journey, one of the Africans managed to unshackle himself and his fellow captives. The captives were armed with knives, which assisted them in taking over the Amistad, which they successfully took control over. They killed the Spanish captain and the ship's cook, who had previously taunted the captives by telling them they would be killed and eaten when they were to arrive at the plantation. After taking control of the ship, Africans needed navigation, so they ordered Montes and Ruiz to return the ship to Africa. The Spaniards secretly changed course at night, which led the Amistad to sail through the Caribbean and end up on the eastern coast of the United States. On August 26th, the U.S. brig Washington found the Amistad. The naval officers captured the ship and put the Africans back in chains, escorting them to Connecticut, where they would claim salvage rights to the ship and its human cargo. Slavery resistance would occasionally move beyond such individual and group acts of confrontation to complete rebellions. Out of many numerous slave revolts, there were 4 well-known slave rebellions that stood out and are well remembered. The first revolt was Gabriel's Rebellion. In Virginia, Gabriel's Rebellion was one of the first major rebellions at a real attempt to fight for freedom. The rebellious slaves of Virginia had a plan to storm the city, which just recently became the state capital. Gabriel gathered and recruited from black Baptist churches, funerals, barbecues, and other gatherings. Many of these people were skilled slave craftsmen that could read and write. Their plan after marching on the city was to kill some of the white locals of the city and then hold the rest as captives, and this included the governor, James Monroe. Their plan was to hold them hostage until their demands for the elimination of slavery was met. There was a hope that poor white people would join the rebellion and that Quakers and Methodists would be spared. Unfortunately, on the night of the rebellion, when the slaves were supposed to gather, a storm washed out the roads to Richmond. The slaves' plans were eventually discovered and the leaders of the rebellion were arrested. 26 of the slaves, including Gabriel, were hung, while dozens more were transported to another state. Although the rebellion was unsuccessful, the conspiracy that was demonstrated proved that slaves possessed the love for freedom. Just like any other person, it showed that fighting for freedom was worth it. 11 years after Gabriel's rebellion followed Andrew's rebellion, otherwise known as the 1811 German Coast Uprising. Andrew's rebellion is one of America's largest slave revolts, if not the largest. Nearly 500 men and women were armed with sugarcane knives, axes, clubs, and a few guns, marched towards New Orleans, destroying property along the way, while proceeding to shout, "Freedom or death." The white population along the route fled in much fear and panic to New Orleans. Slave owners feared a Haitian-style uprising partly because blacks outnumbered whites in the region by a ratio of 5 to 1, and also because of the large population of free blacks in the area that they assumed would assist and support the revolt. Within 2 days of the revolt, the militia and regular army troops met the rebels, which ultimately led to an intense battle. The fighting slaves stood no chance against the militia and lost 66 lives, with many more casualties. After the revolt, the principal leaders were executed. Andrew's rebellion was one of the bloodiest revolts in the United States history. Denmark Vesey was a black carpenter who bought his freedom after winning the lottery. Denmark Vesey was not satisfied with his second-class status as a freed man and determined to help revive the far more oppressive conditions of bondsmen. Vesey secretly planned and organized an uprising of city and plantation blacks. The plan supposedly called for the rebels to attack guardhouses and arsenals, seize their weapons, kill whites, burn and destroy the city, and free all of the slaves. As many as 9,000 blacks may have been involved, though many scholars dispute this proposition. Although this was the plan, the revolt never actually happened. A slave had released the plans to authorities before it could happen. Arguably the best-known slave rebel was Nat Turner in his rebellion. The rebellion was motivated by God choosing Nat Turner to lead a black uprising. Turner and a handful of followers went from farm to farm and would assault the white inhabitants. Eventually, the militia put a stop to the uprising, but not before nearly 80 slaves joining Turner's group of rebels, and an estimated 55 to 60 whites had been killed. Nat Turner's rebellion was the last large-scale rebellion before the Civil War. Similar to Gabriel's and Vesey's conspiracies, Turner's took place outside of the plantation South, where slavery was heavily policed. Turner's revolt was smaller than Gabriel's and Vesey's, which allowed for a slimmer chance of discovery and betrayal. However, his results still displayed conclusively that in an area with whites outnumbering blacks, slaves stood at a severe disadvantage in any violent encounter. Since Turner's revolt was similar, it drove fear and panic. One white Virginian stated that Nat Turner could be in any family. Due to the panic, hundreds of innocent slaves were abused, whipped, and executed. Nat Turner's rebellion led to much debate and opened doors that have been closed for 50 years. Because of the rebellion, there was a turning point in the Old South, and there was much debate for abolishing slavery. Thank you for watching. I hope everyone has a good day.